yes, people are implementing in Alberta, specifically you talk about the remote sites that you only need internet access with low latency. For some, especially stranded gas fields, that's actually very appealing. As Peter talked about, hydro being a very low marginal cost for energy production. But I think stranded gas in Alberta is highly competitive to that. I can see that is comparable or even lower than the cost that I think Chinese miners get from those hydro plants.
So you think we're well positioned in Alberta then to be a potential global leader for proof of work?
Yes, definitely. I think Alberta has so much energy reserves, is so blessed with so much energy reserve that we can access to and can really grow the field and be a leader in the proof of work mining.
Any thoughts on that, Peter?
I'd also go point out that one of the use cases for Bitcoin mining, because of course it generates heat, has been to go and use that heat for things. And you see some people starting to do that with greenhouses as an example, where they'll go install some Bitcoin miners and use the heat to go heat that up. Now, my home province is Ontario, so in theory you might actually see some of that in Ontario, because funny enough, Ontario actually winds up growing a lot of stuff in greenhouses these days. You know, it's got the sun, and then it's got the cold, and for many things, provided you have the sun, it can actually go make sense to run greenhouses. You know, is that being done on the same scale as stranded, natural gas? Not yet, but when you look forward like 10, 20 years, I can see that happening.
And where do you guys see this going? Do you think that we're going to see dedicated Bitcoin mining companies like we do now, or is this going to transition more towards like power companies mining with this stuff?
I think because of the waste heat, you're going to see dedicated Bitcoin mining service companies, as in they will help you manage the Bitcoin mining side of it, but the actual people running the Bitcoin mining equipment will probably be places where they just need heating. In the long run, the marginal cost should be what dominates. The equipment cost should be going down, down, down. And the lowest possible cost for energy is something where you already needed it to go heat something.
Doesn't that compromise the idea that you need to be wasting the energy?
Yes, but it's unavoidable. I mean, if I could invent a magical Bitcoin mining protocol where we truly destroy the energy and dump it into a black hole, but we can't. We have to accept what's reality. The good thing is, in terms of decentralization, heat is something where, first of all, getting rid of heat naturally is decentralized, and using heat is naturally decentralized. This building, we probably need, I don't know, a megawatt or something, in the coldest winters to go and heat this. Some heating engineer is going to laugh at me, but whatever the number is, we need it. But do we need 10? Is that more valuable? No. There's absolutely no reason to have more waste heat here than we need, which naturally spreads out the opportunities and thus spreads out the actual equipment, the hashing power, and so on. And that's actually good for Bitcoin.
All right, I think that's it for my questions. We're going to open it up to the crowd here. I guess we have a cube.
Hey. So I was wondering if you guys had views about the regulatory requirements potentially. I mean, we need to reflect that if stranded gas assets are being used for crypto mining, that means the calibration of the AER and how we collect taxes and fees along the custody transfer routes and the path to market for the gas are completely obliterated. Because if we burn at the site, which we do, and there's at least 3 industrial mining companies doing multi-thousand Bitcoin miners. So I was wondering if you guys had reflections on the regulatory requirements that might be needed to put in place for an energy-centric economy to actually adopt and migrate en masse to this type of thing.
I think it is behind the fence. It's lower than 10 megawatts. I think it's okay. And so there are a lot of different stranded gas sites, I think, throughout Alberta and throughout Canada in general. I think it doesn't need to be one site having massive power consumption. And yeah.
And my understanding too is a lot of the stranded gas is actually a byproduct of oil production. There's a lot of fracking operations, for instance. Naturally released natural gas, and you got to go do something with that natural gas. And the thing that's, for instance, done in a lot of North Dakota, and I've seen this in person from a plane, and you flew over there in the middle of the night, and you can see just the massive number of flares burning off this gas. Every single one of those flares could go properly mine Bitcoin with the right setup. And does that raise regulatory questions? I mean, I'm not a regulator, but it would seem kind of silly to me that it should have major questions when the current alternative is just go burn this stuff off. If the current alternative was to say install compressors and stick it in a pipeline or do something useful with it, that'd be another question. But in a lot of the world, they just burn it off.
To jump on that, I guess, on the regulatory question, and Ray used the term behind the fence, right? That's the current sort of barrier to regulation. And what I think you're describing is these sites that are smaller and able to operate with less regulation. So in an interesting way, and in a lot of different areas, Bitcoin ends up being used for basically regulatory arbitrage. So what's going on is you've got people who are exploiting this less regulated system in a way that was not economically viable to do anything with that power with these small power sites before. So if we take that away, if we add regulation, we're going to be potentially reducing the ability to actually create more utility here. So not surprising, I guess. We have a panel of Bitcoin people. We're probably not going to say we need more regulation.
Well, one of the curious things about Bitcoin mining is I think a little bit of regulation against it actually helps your decentralization, because you do not want Bitcoin mining to be all done out in the open. That's a negative for Bitcoin. That makes it easy to take over the network by finding those miners and doing bad things to them and forcing them to do what the authorities want. You're better off if a chunk of them are underground and tough to find. I don't want to be in a position where I know where 100% of the Bitcoin miners are. That's a very bad thing for Bitcoin. I want a big chunk of that to be total unknowns.
There was a Twitter thread today on the concept of black and gray market mining, and that's big in Venezuela right now, where all the mining there is done by essentially illegal operations. And the speculation in the thread is that you're going to end up seeing, eventually very, very small ASIC chips built into all kinds of things that need heat, like you're describing. So we might have block heaters in our cars that plug in and use power, steal power, essentially. So, yeah, I guess kind of rambling here. But that's sort of where I see it going.
Button on this? Oh, there we go. Okay. So speaking of where the miners are, there tends to be, and it always comes up again and again, worries about miners being centralized in a single jurisdiction. Whether that in the past we've seen a lot of worry about, all of the miners are in China, or all of the mining pools are in China, and that gives a country the possibility of potentially overtaking the network, or 51%ing 51% attacking the network. Could you guys go into a little bit about is that a threat, and if not, why not, and how does that relate to how mining pools function, and so on and so forth?
I mean, I think it can be a temporary threat in that you can have temporary conditions which allow that to happen. And to some extent that probably happened in China. But it's never going to be a long-term threat because energy is distributed widely around the world. As long as Bitcoin mining is done on Earth, it just doesn't make sense to think that any one country is going to have a big monopoly on this for the long term. Now, really going far out into the future, I think you'd actually make a good case we'd have major problems if space travel was cheap, because you'd get mining done outside of Earth, and the Bitcoin protocol just can't handle that. can't handle a situation where miners are literally light minutes away, and it actually takes a long time for information to get around. But if that's a problem, I think I'd be pretty happy with things, because we're kind of making all my boyhood sci-fi fantasies come true. So I'm happy to see that be an issue.
Yeah, I can see mining definitely started in large scale in China. I think 70% of the hash rate is resided in China. But we can see there are more and more decentralization of that processing power that for example in Alberta that we can capture on our cheap power on contributing to the decentralization. And and Bitcoin is essentially, I see it as an energy-backed product. So we do need energy input to protect the system. So so I see that it's getting more and more decentralized as we see cheap energy around the world.
So a follow-up question to Ben's here. Canada's an energy superpower. I was wondering, I know we don't know where all the miners are, but do you know what percentage of the hash rate belongs to Canada? And a follow-up question is, do you ever foresee in the future where a nation like Canada might want to, say, set a target like 5% for national security? They want 5% of the hash rate, Bitcoin hash rate, to exist within their country. I know Russia is kind of looking at that, so I was wondering.
Yeah, I have no idea how much is Canada. I could probably try to get lower bounds based on publicly known miners, but of course how many miners exist that aren't publicly known? I really don't have good numbers on that, and it's a tough one to know. And in terms of setting targets and stuff, I think Bitcoin's just not big enough for people to care about that yet, but it's certainly hypothetically possible. Although I suspect if you did get into that place, the numbers would probably get driven by, as usual in politics, a lot of corruption, a lot of companies with vested interests to get subsidies and so on. And I'm sure that would be a mess, but that's just politics for you.
Yeah, I can say anecdotally that there is massive expansion going on in the mining industry in Canada. There's companies like Ray's company, LuTech, where we invited them out here a year and a half ago roughly for a conference, and they ended up essentially moving here because they identified the opportunity for mining specifically in Alberta. So they're not unique in that sense. There's mostly in Alberta and Quebec right now, a lot more expansion coming online. Problem is, with the very large power setups, it takes potentially several years just to get the power going. So I think we're going to be in a position where we are, at least per capita, disproportionately represented on the Bitcoin network for sure.
Hey guys, I got a question here. And we have proof of work mining, and another part of what was originally running the network was nodes, and they separated. And so I wondered, with all these large mining operations, when I look at the not your node, not your rules type thing, if you're participating in the large monetary section of the network, do you feel there's an incentive for large operators to run node networks, and possibly do node networks become more of an identity source in the future, working in hand with proof of work and the thing that actually states the rules in the network?
Quite simply, no, because nodes that you don't run personally don't matter. I could spin up 100,000 nodes tomorrow, and it just wouldn't matter, because they're not nodes that you're trusting. Nodes. In fact, I've often argued that the Bitcoin protocol should have been designed such that anything was allowed in a block. In the sort of technical term I came up with as client-side validation, where you design a system where the only rules that are applied are ones that are applied at the edge, and that mining does not become attestation of validity. And I think that's actually a much safer network, sort of politically, technically, in the sense that because it forces people to actually validate, it gets away from this misconception that mining is about processing transactions or validation or any of that. That's just, I think, historical baggage from a bad design. I think it's one of the mistakes Satoshi made, that miners have to produce valid blocks. That's a historical mistake. And it's led to, I think, people confusing nodes, you know, run by others as actually mattering. I think it's also led to people confusing what miner's role actually is.
Hello? Oh. Okay, when we think of mining, it's an industrial use case. It's kind of next generation industry. Now, Dave, you mentioned Alberta and Quebec are the big sort of hubs. What are the why companies are landing there? Thinking of, you know, Canada is seen often as an attractive place for miners because we have a stable government, cold climate. But at one point, Quebec had some bad policies they made around miners and energy pricing. What are the key pieces, though, that they are coming to those two jurisdictions? Is it energy prices? Is it the abundance of energy? Thanks.
Yeah, it's power. It's basically comes down to the cheapest power you can find, and that happens to be the hydro in Quebec and the gas in Alberta right now. On the business side, you know, you mentioned Canada being a friendly jurisdiction where we have the rule of law, and you know, it's a good place to do business. We see that in Alberta. That's why we founded my company Bull Bitcoin in Alberta when we merged with a company out of Quebec, is because it is a business-friendly environment. Companies move here for that reason. They move to Quebec for the complete opposite reason. They move to Quebec because they can get subsidies.
Yeah, I agree that I think cheap energy definitely constitutes to I think Bitcoin mining growth in the region, because I think 70% of the operating cost is energy. And specifically Alberta, we have very cheap stranded gas, and Quebec, we have hydro. These really drive the growth of the network in Canada.
And I'll contrast this to, you know, from my discussion with miners, China for a while had the advantage of being physically close to where ASICs were produced. You got shorter shipments. You had very, very cheap labor to go throw stuff together. You could have very low costs in setting up these things because no one cared about safety, as an example. But in the long run, you know, once you get better technology and better ways of setting up mining farms and so on, you know, I think a lot of it really ends up just coming down to, well, what is your marginal cost for energies? Like, you know, we just get better and better at setting up these farms efficiently, and once you're that good at it, well, what matters? Well, what's the marginal cost? You know, it's a very simple calculus there, and certainly your cost ends up getting offset by, like I said, you know, things like heating. But, you know, it's hard to beat Quebec's hydro pricing. It's hard to beat stranded gas pricing.
Oh, there we go. You've talked a lot about the cost of power. How do you see the impact of quantum computing and the power there, and the lack of use of needing power to run that system at such a high speed?
Quantum computers don't do much for mining because quantum computers don't solve hash functions. Depending on how, like, if you got hypothetical quantum computers that actually worked, basically they would go and reduce the difficulty by, if I remember correctly my math, like square root of the number of square root of the size of the hash function bits, which, long story short, makes it appear as though it's like 128-bit versus 256-bit. But then once that's spread, then it gets back to power. You know, quantum, even if everyone was mining with quantum computers, power would still be the limiting factor, because the difference between different miners would converge again, and then it becomes, well, how many hashes per second can you go mine? It doesn't matter what hardware is, using this. Once everyone has the same tech, those marginal differences are all that matter. And frankly, as much hype as there is around quantum computers, there's a heck of a lot of physicists who think that they're never really going to happen. You know, they're essentially unphysical in the claims of what they would be able to do. You know, I personally ended up working on some of that technology in a prior field that I worked in geophysics. And, you know, I'm not an expert on exactly how that stuff works, but I certainly was surrounded by physicists who just looked at it and kind of laughed at it. And the actual results coming out in terms of actual crypto, just aren't that promising yet. Maybe they'll make the breakthroughs, maybe it'll happen, but until that happens, it could just be a pile of snake oil.
Oh, the POS system had these potential to be hacked if somebody were to actually attack it. Do you believe that if you sat down to try and attack a POS system that you could actually break it? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, basically, if I had access to private keys, absolutely can break it. I mean, this has happened before in smaller systems. And ultimately, your critique of it is that POS is centralized around the people who had access to coins and that signing authority. And if it's not centralized around that, your other critique is, well, anyone who can get access to coins can then break it. In a POS design, you get to pick between those sort of two issues, and there's no good solution there. It's if you come up with, this way I'd put it is, in the academic community, they do analysis of POS systems all the time, and they come up with all these great results. But when you look at their preconditions, their assumptions about what's true, they don't really match reality. They do things like say, well, everyone's going to be mining POS. No coins are going to exist where people can get private keys. Or things like everyone has perfect ability to go spread information around, so that if a compromise does happen, you will learn about it, and thus that other side gets punished. These assumptions just don't match reality. Whereas proof of work works with really, really little assumptions. Once you have this assumption that energy can't be created out of thin air, it becomes very easy to validate and very easy to make statements about what bad guys can or can't do.
I think you're supposed to throw it.
I'm glad this is soft. So if I understand correctly, like the Ethereum blockchain is processing around 20 transactions per second. I think the Bitcoin blockchain is less than that. You compare that to centralized systems like Visa that processes around 28,000 transactions per second. We're talking about this huge global shift to pushing more and more things onto blockchain. So the efficiency of a decentralized system is not even coming close to what a centralized system like Visa can do, for example. How do you see the impact of energy consumption? Because if there's much more demand on applications riding on the blockchain, there's going to be a significantly higher demand for power.
I talk about Bitcoin as a store of value in addition to being a payment system, and we know that there are, for example, technology like Lightning Network that's built to enhance the payment speed of Bitcoin. But I still see Bitcoin as its core is the store of value. As for example, I think 7 out of the top 10 family offices in the U.S. own cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin.
I mean, a way I'd go put it is, at home I have a fork that uses no energy at all. Like, how the heck can you go say that an airplane, which uses so much energy, is worthwhile when my fork uses no energy? Reality is Bitcoin and Visa just solve completely different problems and have completely different trade-offs because they have to solve these different problems. Now, the underlying technology of Bitcoin, with few tweaks for technical reasons, I could make it process 1 million transactions per second. That's not very hard, and you could process that with proof of work still being the consensus mechanism. But it would solve a different problem, because the purpose of something like Bitcoin is that I can go verify all those transactions happening, and I know that what's happened has happened. I'm not trusting someone else. The purpose of Visa is to go do payments where there's some central authority running the whole system. And as a Visa user, I don't care that that central authority exists. That's just not part of the criteria. So they can go do things like have 20,000 transactions per second that no one other than Visa can go validate. For Visa, that's okay. For Bitcoin, that's not. It's just completely different use cases. Now, the interesting thing is I could take Visa and say, well, let's make it possible for a third party to audit Visa's system. And if I were given that goal, as a consensus consultant, I would go say, well, yeah, let's go build a blockchain on here and tie that blockchain to Bitcoin so that two different auditors can compare that they're looking at the same data. That would still use Bitcoin for that, 20,000 transactions per second. But it's just a matter of, well, what your design goal is.
Yeah, I think an important thing to add, something I picked out in that question there, as Peter mentioned earlier, the proof of work is not validating the transactions. So the amount of power required to run the Bitcoin network is in no way related to the throughput of transactions that are happening on the Bitcoin network. What's going on is that we're trying to find a way that is provably expensive to agree on a single set of facts. And in the case of Bitcoin, it is roughly every 10 minutes, how has the network changed? And it doesn't matter whether there's one transaction in that block or 1,000. It's the same amount of power to verify it, and it's the same amount of power to compete for that block.
In fact, a further point, the actual amount of energy used by Bitcoin miners ends up relating to the inflation rate, which then in turn relates to what is the market value of the total supply of Bitcoin. That's how these numbers actually come about. Now, you could have Bitcoin have one transaction every week, and the amount of power used for mining would stay the same, because that's where these numbers come out. Why do miners use power? Well, to compete with other miners for the same fixed pot of money. Now, there's also transaction fees on top of that, but we can pretty much ignore them. That the inflation is actually the main source of what drives that energy usage.
So I think we have time for one last question. No pressure, but it better be good. If there is one last question. There we go.
There was a lot of talk, especially at the beginning of your discussion, around there's things that are kind of hidden away or shrouded in a little, we don't know who the miners are, we don't know where the mining is coming from. And throughout the world economy, openness and transparency is what's driving a lot of our movements. So when do you see this happening to Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining and cryptocurrencies, or like where does that intersect?
Well, again, like what problem does Bitcoin solve? A lot of openness and transparency works well in centralized systems where you're trying to go audit what some central authority does. Whereas the problem Bitcoin's trying to go solve is coercion by authority. If we wanted a Bitcoin where a central authority was in charge, you could certainly have openness and transparency. But if you have that design goal, well, why are you even having proof of work? Why don't you just go have them sign blocks? That would be a much simpler, cheaper, faster solution. But it's just not part of our design goal. And I'd also further argue, I don't think openness and transparency is really where a lot of the world's going. I think a lot of that push is really a facade. And what's actually happening is that a lot of that openness and transparency is getting undercut by closed systems that don't actually let you see what's really going on. Something like, say, Facebook is an example. You can argue it's open and transparent in part of what they're doing, but it's also not, in that you don't really understand why the decisions are made. You don't actually have the ability to influence the decisions. And some authority has that ability. Is that open and transparent? Depends on your perspective. But, it's just like a matter of design decisions. In the design decision of Bitcoin, because it wants to resist authority, means that aspects of it are not going to be open and transparent. And a lack of that's actually good for it. On On the other hand, the blockchain itself, it's open and transparent in the sense that what is valid, that's completely transparent and we can all check it, and it's completely open in that nothing can stop anyone from checking it. So, there isn't a simple answer to this question, but I think, again, you always got to go back and look at design goals.
Comes down to what we're trusting, right? In most of these open, transparent systems, we're trusting a government or a bank or something like that. In this case, we're literally just trusting the math.
Let's give our panel a round of applause. So we will get a quick photo with everybody.